John F. Kennedy took a stand in history by fighting for African American rights and for equality. He was born on May 29, 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was born to Rose Kennedy and Joseph Kennedy. He was the second oldest of 9 kids. He was not a very healthy baby. Before he turned 3 years old, he was diagnosed with scarlet fever, which was a life-threatening disease. He was elected as president on November 8, 1960. He was the 35th president. It was a very close race between him and Richard Nixon. He was 43 years old and he was the youngest to ever be elected. And also, he was the first Catholic to be elected as president. When John F. Kennedy became president, segregation was still alive and well. Because of racial segregation, African Americans were looked down upon by society. But John F. Kennedy wanted things to change. He wanted full peace and full equality for African Americans and everyone else in the world. On June 11, 1963, from his Oval Office, John F. Kennedy would give a speech known as the Civil Rights Address. This speech was a response to the National Guard. They were being sent to protect 2 African American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood. They were enrolling at the University of Alabama, but they were threatened due to their race. They had to be backed up by troops just to enter the school. In his speech, he called Americans out and told them that they need to recognize that civil rights was a moral issue and everyone needed to contribute to it. It had been 100 years past since President Lincoln freed the slaves, but yet African Americans were not yet truly free. He felt that us as a nation would not be truly free until African Americans were free. Segregation wasn't just a sectional issue. It was in every single city, in every single state of the Union. By this time, we had already seen acts of bravery by African Americans, such as the bus boycott by Rosa Parks. The bus boycott was when Rosa Parks did not give up her seat to a white man after she had a long day at work, and she was arrested for it. We had also seen Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was all about peaceful protesting and having obedient protests and non-violence due to his Christian beliefs. We also had Malcolm X, but Malcolm X was different from Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't about peaceful protesting. He urged all of his followers to defend themselves against whites by any means necessary. Another thing this speech did was bring the first proposal to the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act would outlaw racial inequality forever. After his speech, Martin Luther King called his speech the most sweeping and forthright ever presented by an American president. 7 months after giving this speech, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd in 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. 2 days after assassinating President Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot dead in the basement of the Dallas police station. Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby. The majority of Americans alive at that time believed that it was a conspiracy. They believed that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the only shooter, and that's still a conspiracy theory to this day. After Kennedy's death in 1963, on July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was enacted. It was a landmark of peace and civil rights. It outlawed discrimination on race, color, religion, gender, and national origin. The Civil Rights Act was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House. The act would later expand to bring disabled Americans to care. It also paved the way for two other laws, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Voting Act prohibited literacy tests. The Fair Housing Act banned discrimination on sale, rental, and financing of property. John F. Kennedy left a legacy. John F. Kennedy took a stand for African American rights. He took a stand for the whole world to be equal, and his legacy will live on forever. John F. Kennedy left an impact on people's lives. He was president when the nation was divided, but yet he stood up for everyone's rights. He didn't care what people thought of him, and he stood for what he thought was right, and he stood for what he believed in all the time. John F. Kennedy's support for blacks was very important in the fight against segregation. He had the ability to rise to the occasion at key moments, first as a war hero, and then ultimately as a president. He challenged Americans to act and treat each other with respect in their daily lives. He had a hard job ahead of him. He had to persuade the public on a very controversial issue that they might not have agreed with. He didn't just show leadership by his words and ideas. He showed leadership by his actions and by his deeds. Many feel like the Civil Rights Address was a game changer, and it gave hope for African Americans, and one day they could be free. Martin Luther King saw him as a visionary, but Malcolm X saw him as an obstacle getting in the way of black liberation. Kennedy inspired a nation in a way that many presidents or Americans will never be able to do. His legacy will forever live on. He will forever live on as a visionary, a leader, a true speaker, and someone who was never afraid.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.